just a reminder that all our talks are brought to us by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. All the books that are on our series are available at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth, so we hope that you go visit the local business and participate in that and can support them. Our guest tonight has kind of made a career of covering iconic people that have impacted pop culture. He's written about Washington Irving and George Lucas and Jim Henson. And tonight he's going to talk about somebody who's a native son of Massachusetts that we all have read. And at the end, we can also ask him why he's been in the news lately. So would you welcome our guest, Brian J. Jones, as he talks about becoming Dr. Seuss.
Hi there, everybody. Mark and I are trying to get the technology to work right here. So Mark's going to give me a share screen here. And I'm going to go ahead and just throw up a PowerPoint here I've got going on Dr. Seuss. So we can talk a little bit about Seuss and his trail to becoming Dr. Seuss, because what I thought was so fascinating about him is that he doesn't really emerge fully formed very quickly. You know, he's not, as a child, he's not Steven Spielberg, who's filming his trains crashing into each other. And people are saying, well, that Steven's going to be a great director. Seuss has a very normal kind of childhood, and it takes him a long time to sort of become what we think of as Dr. Seuss. And there's a number of points in that process where we could have lost him to various other careers. So I want to talk today about, I called the book Becoming Dr. Seuss, because I'm fascinated about what it took for him to go from becoming sort of this, you know, average kid to this terrible student to a cartoonist for a satire magazine to becoming probably the most honored and revered children's book author that we've got. So let me just jump right in here with Seuss. Seuss is born Theodor Geisel, Theodor Seuss Geisel, actually. Theodor Seuss is his mother's maiden name. He's born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1904. And I'm going to go ahead and just call him Seuss the whole time and not call him Geisel, because I think it's a little clearer that. And I'm also going to mispronounce it as Seuss. In the good German manner, it's actually Seuss, but we're going to go ahead and call him Seuss. And he always said that you know, he liked it being pronounced Seuss because it sounded like Mother Goose. So this is Seuss when he's shortly after he's born, with his mother, Henrietta Seuss, and his father, who's also Theodor Geisel. There's a lot of Theodor Geisels. His grandfather is also Theodor Geisel. Again, born 1904 in Springfield, Massachusetts. There we go. I'm sorry, I'm getting used to the way this machine works. So here's Seuss as a kid, and it's a very normal childhood for him. So there he is with his father on the left, dressed, playing cowboys and Indians on the right, playing in his toy car. Seuss was more likely to be found playing with his toy soldiers on the steps of his house than drawing cartoons and writing books or anything like that. Again, it's just a very sort of ordinary childhood, which is part of what makes him so remarkable where he ends up. So when Seuss is in high school, this is when he starts to get into think about becoming an artist. This is some of his very first art from his high school newspapers. It's not fantastic. I mean, I'm glad people aren't looking at the cartoons I did when I was a junior and a senior in high school, but this is some of his early work. It doesn't really look like what we would think of as Dr. Seuss art. You know, it's competent enough art for a high school student, but this is some of his very early stuff. And we're going to follow his signature. I don't know if the arrow shows up. You can see here, this one's signed TSG for Ted Seuss Geisel. We're going to follow that signature along as we go. And you'll start to see that signature line evolve as well as he becomes Dr. Seuss. So this is Seuss, his senior year in high school. This is his senior year high school photo. And this is the first place we start to see him doing something we would think of as Seussian. His senior year in high school, he writes and stars in a one-act comedy called Chicopee Surprised. And after the intermission, he writes and largely performs a minstrel show where he plays the banjo and writes and performs all his own, some original songs and some that were sort of standards at the time. But Seuss at this age loves writing lyrics. So this is where we start to see his love of meter and rhyme and verse is showing up in some of his very early interests. So this is one of the first moments we see him sort of, doing something we think of as Seussian. It's interesting if you look here on the card, they've got his name actually spelled wrong, Theodor with an E. He doesn't actually have the E in his name, but that was a common mistake throughout his life. So when Seuss graduates from high school, he goes to the school up the road, which is actually Dartmouth University. It's an Ivy League school, of course, but when you live in Springfield, especially at that time, it was kind of the school that you went to if you lived in Western Massachusetts. It was just up the river. So Seuss heads up to Dartmouth to study English, primarily using the recommendation of a favorite high school English teacher who writes him sort of a lukewarm recommendation. But it is a competent enough student that he wants to go to, he's going to go off to Dartmouth and he wants to study English. However, when he gets to Dartmouth, the thing he really wants to do more than anything else is work at the Dartmouth Jack-o'-lantern. And the Jack-o'-lantern is Dartmouth's equivalent of the Harvard Lampoon. It's the humor magazine, the satire magazine that pretty much every Ivy has one. Columbia has one, Harvard has one, and this is Dartmouth's version of this. Seuss, from the moment he walked in the doors at Dartmouth, wanted to work for the Jack-o'-lantern, wanted to be part of that Jack-o'-lantern crew. This is one of the very first cartoons he ever does for Jack-o'-lantern. 2 arguments against matrimony. Okay, that's kind of funny. It's a pretty good joke. And you can see the signature, Ted G. So he's still signing Ted Geisel. But so this is one of his first, sort of published cartoons. Not a bad one. But he continues to just hang out in the Jacko. They always call it Jacko, in the Jacko artists, in the Jacko offices, and is submitting written pieces. And really, his main ambition, more than getting his degree, is to be the editor of Jack-o'-lantern, which he eventually gets to by his senior year. This is one of his cartoons from around his senior year, where you're starting to see sort of these Seussian animals to it. Why is it one sees animals like this, one never has a gun along? So we've got, the elephant with the shoes on over here. You can see this is an early version of Seussian cats here that I'm circling with the hats on. And this goat over here with the wings, Seuss loves this goat with wings. This shows up in an awful lot of marginalia he does at the time. But this is some of his, again, his senior year work, starting to look a little more Seussian in the sense that just we're seeing some of those fantastic animals that Seuss always did so well. Okay, this is an important cartoon in his college career for a number of reasons. First of all, look at the signature we have down here, T. Seuss. So this is him using his mother's maiden name as his pseudonym. And it's one of the first times he does it. Now, Seuss loved using those play names. There's one cartoon that's all about milk where he signs it El Pasteur. So he was always very fond of using these sort of joke fake names for his work. But this is one of the first times we ever see Seuss in print. And again, this is a pretty good joke. Goat milk is higher than ever. You notice he has to parse out that the goat's in the Alps, but the udder's up elevated higher. Seuss loved to tell a story his entire life about why he used his mother's maiden name. Typical of Dr. Seuss, it is probably not true, but Seuss never let the truth stand in the way of giving a great story. And his story goes like this. His senior year, he is caught in his room drinking. And this is during Prohibition, so drinking is purely prohibited at that time. And Seuss is the grandson of a very successful brewer. Seuss's grandson Theodor is a very successful brewer in Boston, in Springfield, but who loses everything essentially during Prohibition. So, but you could never quite take the brewer out of the brewer's son. So Seuss has smuggled gin into his room and is caught drinking in the room. And as part of his punishment, the dean tells him that he is not permitted to submit work, have any of his work published in the humor magazine anymore. And for Seuss, who really wanted to be editor of Jacko, this is the worst punishment possible. This happened in April of his senior year, so we only had about a month to go. But the story Seuss liked to tell is because he had been punished and was told he could not have his work appear in Jacko for the rest of his college career, that he then went to submitting work under this fake name. That is a fantastic story. I wish it were true. Unfortunately, it's not. This issue was actually at the printers before Seuss even got caught drinking. So the timing almost worked out, but not quite. So if you go and look at the publishing schedule, it doesn't quite line up. But again, it's a fantastic story. I wish it were entirely true. It is not. So after he graduates from Dartmouth with middling grades, his average is about a middle C, he is accepted to Oxford. He's accepted to Oxford on a scholarship. And this is another great Seussian story. He actually isn't accepted on a scholarship. He applied for a scholarship, and his father was so excited that his son had applied for the scholarship that he told the editor of the newspaper across the street that Ted was going to Oxford. When Ted did not get the scholarship, his father, in order to save face, paid to send him to go to Oxford anyway. So Seuss goes to Oxford in about 1924 or so to get his degree in English. He wants to become an English teacher, so he's going to go and try to get that PhD in English. This is a copy of Seuss's notebook from his first year there at Oxford. Typical of him, the opening of the book, as you go through it, the pages are filled with copious notes about the classes he's taking, and then the drawings begin to creep into the margins, as you can see here. And as you continue to flip through this book, the margins begin to encroach upon the text, and they fill up more and more and more with drawings until eventually all that's left is the drawings. Seuss is sitting next to a young woman in class who's a couple years older than him, who looks at the drawings and says, in fact, she looked at one of the drawings of those goats that I showed you with the wings, and says, somebody who can draw like that, you have absolutely no business being an English teacher. You need to do that for a living. And so Seuss decides to drop out of Oxford, marry the girl who told him that, and returns to the United States to work in New York City during sort of the Gilded Age. And so this is 1920s New York. It's a great time if you're the son of a brewer. Ted and his wife loved going around to the speakeasies. They always knew where all the speakeasies were in New York. Were regular drinkers out on the town. But Seuss is submitting work to Vanity Fair and Life magazine, and it's so weird to believe that you could actually earn a living drawing cartoons for magazines back then. But sure enough, you could. And so this is what Seuss is doing to try to make his way as a young man. He actually ends up becoming the regular artist for the humor magazine Judge, which is sort of an early Mad magazine. You can see this is cover January 3rd, 1931. This is Seuss's version of waking up with a hangover. Literally, there's the hangover in the bed with him. It's starting to look a lot more like that Seussian style we see. But this cartoon I've put up on the left-hand side, the Knights of Your Round Table. This is one of the first places we actually see him starting to call himself Dr. Seuss. We're hedging our bets on this because he signed it, translated from Merlin's Memoirs by Dr. Theophrastus Seuss. Theophrastus was his stuffed dog that he loved very, very much and kept with him his entire life. But he would put Dr. Seuss on a piece if he was trying to give it sort of this false sense of erudition. So he's doing a lot of cartoons about the Arthurian era and what the knights are doing, and doing it with this very much mock seriousness, trying to do all this with a straight face. So when he does something like that, he tends to call himself Dr. Theophrastus Seuss to try to give that comedy a little bit of gravitas that isn't actually there. This, however, is the very first time we actually see him signing his cartoons as Seuss. So this is another long piece he wrote called An Origin of Contract Bridge. He wrote the entire piece and illustrated it. And you can see at the bottom here, he's got his name Seuss signed right down there in the corner. He's got it white on black if you can see it. This is the very first time we ever see the name Seuss signed to any of his art. So he's used it as Theophrastus Seuss, signing a text piece. This is the first time we see it in his art. So he's Seuss here, and you can see at the top it says a treatise by Dr. Seuss, and then the art itself is signed to Seuss. So this is actually a pivotal moment in his career, and that he's all in now on officially calling himself Seuss, which, remember, was his mother's maiden name. So this is one of his game-changing cartoons at the time. And again, it's not really that funny. You can see it's a knight in bed with the weirdest looking dragon you've ever seen, sticking his head underneath the bed. into his lap, and the knight is saying, "Darn it all, another dragon, and just after I'd sprayed the whole castle with flit." Now, flit is a popular a popular bug killer at the time, similar to Raid nowadays, for example. And there were two big brands back then, Flit and something called Flytox. And as Seuss told it, he was flipping a coin to decide which brand to use, and it came up heads, which meant he was going to use Flit. So his punchline here is, "After I'd sprayed the whole castle with Flit." Well, what happens with this cartoon is the wife of this is one of those really serendipitous moments in his life. The wife of the ad man at McCann Erickson. If you're a Mad Men fan, you probably know McCann Erickson. The man who has this account, his wife sees this cartoon while she's at the beauty shop. And as Seuss later said, if she's reading this magazine at the beauty parlor, they have terrible magazines. She sees this cartoon and goes back to her husband and says, "This is the greatest ad campaign for Flit you could possibly ask for." And they call Seuss and they hire him to be the ad man for the Flit campaign, which is run by Standard Oil. It's one of their products. So he becomes the ad man for Flit, and he does these Flit ads for the next 17 years. Now he comes up with a sort of masterful bit of a punchline. "Quick Henry the Flit" became the catchphrase of the Flit campaign. This was the equivalent of, I'm going to date myself here, this is the equivalent of "Where's the Beef?" This is a gigantic ad campaign. Everybody knows this punchline. Quick Henry the Flit shows up in songs in the era. Comedians could use it as a punchline, an easy punchline. People got the joke. So this is his big account, and he is one of the best admin around, just basically on the power of Quick Henry the Flit. So this is the way Seuss is earning his living. He's still drawing cartoons for Vanity Fair and Life and things like that, but he is primarily an ad man for Standard Oil doing the Flit campaign. I love the one that says "Now with DDT." But because he's got this ad job with Standard Oil, he's locked into a fairly rigorous contract that doesn't permit him to take a lot of outside work. One of the things he's permitted to do is illustrate not other accounts, but he's permitted to do some book work. So this book, Boners, is sort of like Kids Say the Darndest Things. It's actual quotes from kids in classrooms that are very funny, sort of malapropisms, that Seuss is hired as the artist to illustrate this book. And I think there's about 30 illustrations of this book, again, based on his strength and his reputation as that ad man for the Flit campaign. So he's hired on to illustrate Boners, and this is a huge seller. In fact, it's so big they go back, and I think there's 2 more volumes of these that Seuss does books for. And Seuss is very impressed with the fact that these books are earning a lot of money. He's not permitted to write a book like this, although he can illustrate it. But the one thing he's not precluded in his contract from doing is he is permitted to write and draw children's books. So Seuss initially gets into children's books because there's money on the table, not because he feels any sort of compelling desire to tell stories for children, although that certainly comes later. And to think that I Saw it on Mulberry Street comes out of a cruise that he's taking. He and his wife are on a steamship coming back across the Atlantic Ocean, and they get caught in a storm. And Seuss sits in the bar, because if Seuss is given his druthers of staying in his cabin or sitting in a bar, he'll usually choose the bar. And Seuss sits in the bar and he's listening to the rhythm of the engines churning away beneath him. And it is churning away in what I found out later is called Anapestic Tetrameter. It's sort of the rhythm of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." And that's the rhythm of "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street." So Seuss had that rhythm in his head and said, I wanted to put words to it so I didn't go crazy. And those words that he put down so he wouldn't go crazy become "And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street," which he writes and illustrates. Seuss has a great story about this book, in that it was a book initially nobody wanted to publish. He hauled it all around New York. This is back in the day when you just had to walk from publisher to publisher and try to, with your book tucked under your arm, and try to sell it. And Seuss submitted this book 37 times or 57 times or 97 times or 300 times, as he often told the story as through the years. Probably 37 is closer to the right number. And it was rejected 37 times. And finally, as he was walking back down Madison Avenue, he ran into an old college friend of his from Dartmouth who had just been hired by Vanguard Publishing, who said, "What have you got under your arm?" And Seuss said, "I have this children's book nobody wants." And his friend Mike McClintock said, "Let me bring this upstairs to my editor and we'll see what we can do." And so Mike McClintock, his Dartmouth friend, And the editors at Vanguard took on Dr. Seuss in his first book, And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street was published in 1930, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I forgot, 38, I believe. So based on that book, Seuss is then permitted to do several more. The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins he does for Vanguard, and then he's recruited by Bennett Cerf, the editor at Random House, who really admires Seuss and his work and hires him away to come and start doing books for Random House. Seuss's first book for Random House is a book he called his Naked Lady book, The Seven Lady Godivas, which if you want to talk about banned Dr. Seuss books, this was the first. and the book that you know is Horton Hatches the Egg, which he publishes in 1940. But primarily, you know, these aren't really the books of Seuss you know. They're not selling well, which I know is still hard for us to believe, but they're not selling enough for him to make a living at it. So he's still doing his work as an ad man. That's primarily what he's still doing on through the 30s and on into 40s. He's still the flit ad campaign man. Along about 1941 or so, he becomes an editorial cartoonist for PM newspaper. PM is a progressive newspaper in New York City. Seuss at this time is living in California, but he's reading the newspapers every morning, drawing an editorial cartoon, and then express mailing it back to New York in time to be published the next morning. And Seuss is pretty successful at this. In fact, he quits doing kids' books altogether to become a full-time editorial cartoonist for PM newspaper. PM newspaper is the only one in New York that sort of got this, if you, as you might want to call it, the progressive point of view. All the other newspapers in New York are Hearst newspapers. And Seuss is very much about American preparation. He doesn't necessarily want the United States to enter the war, but as he keeps saying, I kept thinking somebody's going to sock us. Sock is the word he always uses. Someone's going to sock us. We have to be prepared. So he was all about preparation. And he also really had Charles Lindbergh's number early. He didn't like the way Lindbergh talked about America first, and he rightly identified Lindbergh as an anti-Semitic and called him out in the pages of PM newspaper, the only person who was really doing it at the time. And this is the way Seuss always drew Hitler, which I find fascinating because I think it's actually a really terrifying interpretation of Hitler. Most people drew Hitler at that time as sort of a raging maniac with, you know, his feet off the ground and his fists flying. Seuss's Hitler is always very calm. He's always got his eyes closed, very calm as he wreaks havoc, which I think is sort of a terrifying version of Hitler. Here's some of his other editorial cartoons. You might actually see some of these on the internet. These tend to show up a lot, especially this one on the left. This one on the left is one with Seuss hitting Charles Lindbergh. This is shortly after Lindbergh made his big statement at, I think, Madison Square Garden about the Jewish race and how, you know, the Jewish race were trying to get us into the war. It was really, you know, trying to identify them as the other and really rub Seuss the wrong way. This is the cartoon that came out shortly thereafter. You can see he's got the American eagle with the sign that says, "I am part Jewish." And the sign, you know, locked in the socks with the sign saying, "Public notice, this bird is possessed of an evil demon." Sheriffs Charles Lindbergh and Gerald Nye, who was another America First senator at that time. So again, this is Seuss unloading with both barrels on Charles Lindbergh and the America First mentality, which again, Seuss had no patience for. And this cartoon on the right came out during the war. Eventually, Seuss ended up enlisting in the army. But this cartoon came out shortly before he left for the army, and you can see it's got Uncle Sam spraying bug spray in somebody's ear, and he's saying, "Gracious, what was that in my head?" And the bug coming out his ear says, "Racial prejudice bug." I think Seuss is poking a little fun at himself with this one, given that he had made a living out of selling insecticide. So I think I think this is a joke, kind of partly on him. But again, what you would consider a very progressive point of view, especially, you know, the sort of lone voice for this in the New York City newspapers. Seuss ends up enlisting in the army. He enlists at age 39, as he always said, because he was drawing those editorial cartoons. He said, "I got us into this, so I figured I might as well enlist." So he enlists at age 39. He's initially a captain, becomes a major, I think ends up being a lieutenant colonel by the time he's out of the military. So this is Seuss when he first enters the army. Now he goes into the Signal Corps, and he's actually stationed stateside. He's stationed in California on what they always called Fort Fox. It was the old 20th Century Fox lot, because he's put into the Army Signal Corps, and his commanding officer is Frank Capra. and this is Capra at his desk. Capra is going to be very important in Seuss's story. So he's Seuss's commanding officer, but one of the things Capra is in charge of is recruitment films and training films and American propaganda films. And one of the ideas that Capra has is for a series of training films on a cartoon character who trains American soldiers by doing everything wrong. And Capra figured, well, we could show this character doing everything wrong, and so the boys will learn how to do everything right by not following this character's example. This was at a time when, you know, there was a lot of the military, a lot of the soldiers themselves were not very literate. And so what Capra had noticed was when they were watching training films, they tended to really perk up when there were cartoons shown. And so he said, we're going to do cartoons to train them. So he does something brilliant here. He pairs Seuss with a civilian in charge of this effort to be his animator and help him storyboard this, named Chuck Jones. And Chuck Jones is a young animator at Warner Brothers. Chuck Jones ends up being in charge and writing, or in most cases directing, every Looney Tunes cartoon you probably love. He does What's Opera Doc and just, you know, Hairbrained Hair, just countless cartoons that are played. He invents the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. So, but at this point in his career, Chuck Jones is still an up-and-comer, but has a very similar sense of humor to Dr. Seuss's, and Capra is savvy enough to pair them together. Capra is important in Seuss's story for another reason too. He's the one that taught Seuss how to write, in a sense that he would have Seuss bring his scripts in and told Seuss, I'm going to go through your scripts and I'm going to underline in blue pencil your plot. This is every time you're moving the story forward. And if I hand you back a script that has nothing underlined, you have a problem. It means you're boring your reader. Seuss really took that to heart. He really understood from that point on that plot really mattered. The plot is what kept people returning. Plot kept everything going. So that's what one of Capra's big contributions to Seuss. The other big contribution comes from Chuck Jones himself. Chuck Jones, you can see behind him, this is a storyboard for a cartoon he's got on the wall behind him for Sniffles the Mouse cartoon. That was what Chuck was doing right before he hooked up with Dr. Seuss. And Chuck Jones is the one that taught Dr. Seuss how to storyboard. And he said the great thing about storyboard, you can see on this drawing here on this card, you know, they're pinned to a board. He said, you know, put your drawings up on the wall and then step away from them and stare at them and move them around and figure out what's working and what's not. This was a practice that Seuss would really take to heart. And for the rest of his life, he would storyboard his children's books, pin them to, you would walk into his office, you would find them pinned to the corkboard in his office. So that was a lesson he really took to heart as well from Chuck Jones. So here's a little bit of what they end up doing. They do the Private Snafu cartoon. And again, Snafu is the one that would show you how to do it by doing everything wrong. Not paying attention, you fall in the hole. And these are hugely successful cartoons. As American taxpayers, these were produced for the Department of Defense. So you own these. You can go to the National Archives website and watch all of these. They're great. Some of them are written in Seussian verse. They sound like Dr. Seuss cartoons. Some are not. Some were not written by him. But they're all great, and I encourage you to go find them. You also find them on YouTube, but the National Archives is where you'll find most of them. So you know, this is a very successful effort to train American soldiers, and Seuss was very proud of this. He actually ended up getting the Legion of Merit medal for his work in training men and training the army, and was very proud of that. For the rest of his life, he would make sure that showed up on his own bio. So, so this is what Ted's doing in the military at the time. He's also writing propaganda films about what do we do in Germany after the war's over? How do we bring the German people back into the world stage? How do we do this with the Japanese people? So he's already thinking post World War II. How do we incorporate people who were previously our enemies back in back into the world? So Seuss, after the war, ends up back stateside, and is taking a lot of the lessons that he's learned. Now, I stay stateside. He was stateside the entire time, but he's back at home. He took a lot of the lessons he learned from Chuck Jones and from Frank Capra, and he becomes sort of a fixer for Hollywood movie scripts. And he's hired to punch up scripts. One of the early stories he's brought in to adapt is Rebel Without a Cause. In the initial sort of, it was initially based on the writings of a psychiatrist, and Seuss's version is straight out of that book, and it's nothing like the movie that was eventually made because they rewrote the script entirely. But that was one of the first jobs he had as sort of a Hollywood hired gun for screenwriting. He's eventually given his own film to write, which becomes The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T. You know, this movie, you can find it, I think, on Amazon. It is worth watching because it really does look like a Dr. Seuss book has sort of exploded out into the real world. The experience making it was absolutely miserable for Seuss. This is the point at which he vowed to get out of film altogether. Because he likened it to writing a book and writing a script by committee, that everything would go upstairs to the suits upstairs who all had to have their input into the story and into the script. So this was the experience that sort of soured Seuss on film, but it takes him, you know, several years. So this is one of the points at which we could have lost him to film, to making movies, to being a script doctor, and to writing and drawing his own, you know, writing his own films. But except Dr. T left such a terrible taste in his mouth that he opted to get out of film altogether and goes back instead to writing books regularly. Now, he's also still doing his ad work because, again, even these children's books that he's producing aren't generating enough income for him to do it full time. He's still the guy in charge of the Flit ad campaign. And he's doing ads for sugar companies and a number of other things. He's very much an in-demand artist and ad man, and you know, has ad campaigns for sugar where it's always got a goat eating somebody's hat and asking for the sugar on the hat, you know. So he's got all these really great and fun campaigns. But these are the books he's at work on, about, as you can see, about a book a year on through 1956 or so. A lot of these you don't know. You've got Horton Hears a Who in here. That's probably the one that you know the best. Most of these are sort of, you know, he's putting them everywhere. They're getting well reviewed. But they're just not earning him enough income to do it full time. So something really important happens in 1950. This is Dr. Seuss at home in his study. He loves carving these wooden sort of Seussian animal heads and then putting real horns on them. So these are hung all over his office. There's several different versions of these with different kind of horns, but he loved these. And also I love this picture because this is him. He was a lifelong smoker. It ended up being contributing partly to what killed him in his old age, but he was always trying to stop smoking by sucking on a pipe. And what he would do with the pipe was he would actually just fill it with radish seeds. And every time he wanted to smoke, he would use an eyedropper and water it. And this one actually, I think, is a cucumber seed sprouting out of it, but he would do that until the cucumber or the radishes sprouted, and then he would go back to cigarettes. So this is Seuss in about 1954, smoking his pipe with the cucumbers in it. This oh my God, all of a sudden I've forgotten his name. I'm so sorry. So in the pages of Life magazine, this is the Nobel Prize winning author of Hiroshima, whose name all of a sudden escapes me. John Hersey, thank you. Whew. This is John Hersey, and in the pages of Life magazine in 1954, Hersey writes a piece doing what we kind of do about every 5 years, even today, is we wring our hands and wonder why kids aren't reading. And, you know, what's the matter with kids today? Nowadays, we always talk about this, you know, they're all on their phones, or they're all playing video games, or they're all streaming, or they're TikToking, and so they're not reading and they're not learning. What's the matter with kids? Well, Hersey's theory at that time was one of the reasons kids don't learn how to read and they're reading behind their grade level is because the reading primer we give them, Dick and Jane, are absolutely awful. You know, Hersey thought nobody wants to read about Dick and Jane and their lives of quiet desperation and this terrible, boring, horrible, you know, baby powder art that's on it. You know, the text itself is bad enough, although it's educator approved, but Hersey lamented at the end of this article, couldn't we just get somebody different to illustrate Dick and Jane? Couldn't we get, you know, Walt Disney? How about Dr. Seuss? Can't Dr. Seuss illustrate Dick and Jane? Well, Seuss didn't actually read this article, but someone else did. And it was an editor at one of the children's, oh my gosh, McGraw-Hill, I believe, who read this article and brought in Seuss and said, you know, I want you to write me a book that a first grader can't put down. I don't want you just drawing a kid's book, a reading primer. I want you writing and drawing a reading primer. Now, the catch he's got is reading primers actually have a pedagogy behind them. Reading primers have an educator created and educator approved reading list, a vocabulary list that looks something like this. So Seuss is given this vocabulary list of about 350 words, and you can't deviate from this list. And that makes it really hard. They compared it to a literary straitjacket, in that if you need a plural and the plural isn't on the list, you can't use it. You can use the word boy, but if the word boys isn't on the list, plural, you can't use it. And the verbs are very limited. So it's a very restrictive word list. And Seuss stares at this list for a long time, about a year, trying to figure out what he wants to write about. He said at one point he wanted to write a book about a zebra queen, neither of which word was on his list. He had just written On Beyond Zebra, so he had zebras on the mind. Zebra's not on that approved word list, neither's queen. He wanted to write about mountains and mountain climbing, and the word mountain's not on the list. So he's having just a heck of a time figuring out what he wants to write about. As he later told it, I went through the list and I was going to give up, but I decided to read the list one more time. And the first two words that rhymed, I decided I would make that my main character. He initially said the tall ball, but that one's no good. So we're glad he didn't take that one and went instead with the cat in the hat. And the Cat in the Hat is the game changer for Seuss. The Cat in the Hat comes out in 1957 when Seuss is 54 years old. So, he's already spent a lot of his life dabbling at kids' books, but now this is his big hit. But the Cat in the Hat is very different from the other books Seuss has done in that it's got that educator-approved word list behind it. And that's what makes this book so important. I didn't know that when I started researching and writing about Seuss, but that's what makes this book so important. It's got the trifecta. Kids want to read it because it's funny. Parents don't mind reading it over and over again. If you're a parent who reads to your kid, you read the same book 3,000 times. Parents actually loved reading this book. It was fun to read. And educators approved of it because it used that educator-approved word list. So this is the rising tide that then floats all boats. All of Seuss's backlist starts to sell. This allows him to finally become Dr. Seuss full-time. Now he's going to be the writer and artist of children's books, primarily for a while using that word list. But there's another book that comes out in 1957. I mean, imagine getting lightning in a bottle, not just once in a year, but twice. Cat in the Hat comes out around Easter. Around Christmas, this book comes out. The Grinch comes out. I mean, imagine creating two iconic characters in the span of 6 months. And that's what Seuss does. And these are two remarkable books of his that make his name. Now, understand that the Grinch does not use that restrictive word list. This is independent of those books. Seuss called these his big books, whereas those other ones had that word list. The Grinch, I always tell people, tell me what color the Grinch initially was. In the original Grinch book, he's not colored. The only color they use is red, which you see in Santa's suit and in the Grinch's eyes. The color of the Grinch would be determined by the 1960s television special, and that was his collaborator on that was actually, if anybody know, Chuck Jones, who we already talked about at Warner Brothers. Chuck Jones is the one who helped Seuss decide that the Grinch was going to be green. So anyway, this is 1957, The Cat in the Hat and The Grinch in the same year, a really incredible year for Dr. Seuss. Based on the strength of The Cat in the Hat, Seuss is asked to preside as editor-in-chief and president of a brand new imprint of books at Random House called Beginner Books. And its offshoot is also Bright and Early Books. So beginner books are initially launched to target, first and second grade, young early readers using that word list, so that restrictive word list. And Bright and Early Books have an even more restrictive word list. They're aimed for even sort of like kindergarten age students. So their word list is even shorter than that. Cat in the Hat, for example, ended up using about 180 unique words in its vocabulary. Something like Hop on Pop, Green Eggs and Ham, Fox and Socks, their word lists are much smaller. The list of words you can use is, as opposed to 300 and some odd numbers for beginner books, the Bright and Early Books have are less than 200 unique words. So really tough writing. Green Eggs and Ham is actually written as a bet. Bennett Cerf, who the publisher of Random House, after the great success of The Cat in the Hat, says to Seuss, okay, smart guy, you wrote us a bestseller for first graders using that really restrictive word list. I'll bet you can't write a book that uses less than 50 unique words. That book that uses less than 50 unique words. I think it actually uses 48, ends up being Green Eggs and Ham, which is still the best-selling Seuss book to this day. This is the one, and watch what he does in there. He's repeating words a lot to make the rhyme scheme work and to make readers understand the words. It's really a brilliant bit of subterfuge in a way, because it seems like there's a whole lot more words in there than there really are. Through the repetition, Seuss is doing a lot of work through just the rhythm. As you always said, the rhythm is where we get them. So this is what Seuss is doing through a lot of the 1960s and on into the 70s. And this is where he's doing the work that we come to think of as his Seussian sort of work. These are the books that everybody reads, that people hand their kids to read for the very first time. So again, these are the books that have that pedagogy behind them, which is what makes beginner books and bright and early books so important. Again, educator approved, kids love them, parents love them. One of the other responsibilities Seuss has as the head of beginner books is he's sort of the great recruiter. He brings in a lot of other writers and artists to write these books for beginner books. One of his first big gets is the Berenstains, Stan and Jan Berenstain. Their first Berenstain Bears books are edited by Dr. Seuss, who recruited them specifically to tell stories for beginner books. So their first book is The Big Honey Hunt. They went on to have a very successful career writing and drawing Berenstain Bears for beginner books. When I told everybody I was working on Dr. Seuss, everybody said, "Oh my God, I love Are You My Mother?" Are You My Mother is actually by P.D. Eastman, who was a friend of Dr. Seuss. He knew him from the Signal Corps, had worked with him on the Private Snafu cartoons. So that's a P.D. Eastman story. But, again, it's understandable. The lettering looks sort of Seussian, and it certainly got the cat in the hat on the cover. Another book that everybody loves, everyone said, oh, the other Dr. Seuss book I love is Go Dog Go. Sorry, that one is also P.D. Eastman. But again, this is Seuss's ability to hire the right people to do this kind of work for beginner books and bright and early books. Now, at the same time, once the 70s come along, Seuss is these are all what he called his big books. None of these have that restrictive word list. This is Seuss, allowed to sort of do what he does. These are significant, and these are sort of his message books. Seuss was never a big one for incorporating messages into his books. He always said that was cheating. That people would see a moral coming a mile away. So he said he always intentionally, if you wanted to read a moral into it, that was fine with him, but he always said he never really put one in there. Yertle the Turtle, he would confess to that one was deliberately him parodying Adolf Hitler. But a book like the Lorax is a deliberately political book. This is one he said he wrote because he got mad. And this is his environmental book. This is one of the most banned Seuss books until recently. One of the most banned books, and it's primarily banned in logging communities like Idaho, Montana, because people thought it was an anti-logging book. And what Seuss always pointed out was, I live in a house made out of wood, and I write books that are published on paper. I'm clearly not anti-paper and anti-wood. I just believe in being responsible with what we've got. So that's the Lorax from about 1972. You're Only Old Once is his book about getting older. Seuss, as he got older, was constantly having health issues, primarily around his mouth. Again, he was developing mouth cancer from smoking, and he was pushed and poked and prodded constantly. So You're Only Old Once, a book for obsolete children, the title that I love, is primarily about just the misery of going through those experiences with doctors who want to push and poke and prod and then hand you a bill. It's also important in that it's one of the few books where he has people in it. Seuss doesn't normally draw people, but You're Only Old Once has people in it. The Butter Battle book came out at the height of the Cold War in the mid-'80s. I was in high school when this book came out, and it terrified me. This is about mutually assured destruction. And it's about the two different groups who are fighting over which side of your bread you butter. If you're buttering on the wrong side of the bread. And so there's a wall between these two groups of people, and they keep building different and larger weapons to point at each other until the very end of the book, when they each have these gigantic weapons pointed at each other, and the child asks his grandfather, who will drop it? And the grandfather says, we shall see, and leaves it on one of the most terrifying cliffhangers in children's literature. It was really his contribution to discussing the Cold War. He said, I don't have all the answers, but I think we need to talk about this honestly and openly with kids. And this was his effort, his attempt to do that, look those kids straight in the eye, which is one of the things that makes his work so important. Finally, Oh, the Places You'll Go. This was his final book. And he knew it was going to be his final book, and it is filled with images that call back his work on Judge, his work at Dartmouth. You know, you'll see a lot of little nods to characters you know, even as you don't actually see those characters in the book. It's a really remarkable book. This is one of his best-selling books as well, behind Green Eggs and Ham, because it's perpetually given at graduation time, and when people get new jobs, and when people move, and when people get promoted, people receive this book as a gift. So this book is, you'll see it show up on the bestseller list in May because graduation comes along. So every year this book is just blowing them out. So this is one of his most popular books as well. It was his last book. Mike Frith, who was a friend and editor of his, told a great story about being in their offices at Random House when the pages for this book arrived, and flipping through them and turning to another writer at Random House and said, "You know what this is, don't you? It's Ted telling us goodbye." And sure enough, he was. Seuss died shortly thereafter. He died in 1992. Lived a really long life. He died of the complications from cancer in his mouth. I love this photo I'm going to put up here because this is him signing books on the green at Dartmouth in the 50s, and this little girl is not buying whatever it is he is selling. But I think what continues to make Seuss and his work so important is because, I mean, he's sitting at their table and having a conversation with every single child who comes up to him, whether they buy it or not. Seuss was the first writer really willing to look them in the eye and have a conversation with them. And he was the first children's book author to really take them seriously as readers, and said, you know, kids deserve great books that they want to read. He thought the worst thing you could do to a child was give them a book you thought they should be reading. He said that was the cruelest thing you could do, and he never wanted to do that to a child. And so I think that's one of the reasons that Seuss is so important. And again, partly, remember, he's got that educator approved vocabulary list as well. So educators don't have a problem handing his books out in class. But more than that, it's a book that kids want to read because Seuss wants to have that conversation with them. He wants to let them know they're valued as readers and as people. And adults love those books too. And that was one of the things Seuss said at the end of his life. He got the Pulitzer Prize for his life's work, not for any particular work, but for his entire career. And as he pointed out at the time, he was so relieved that the Pulitzer Committee understood that he didn't write for children, he wrote for people. And that was where he wanted to be. That was the contribution he wanted. And when people asked him ultimately what he wanted to be remembered for, his comment was to spread joy. How's that?
Thank you, Brian. That was awesome. If anybody's got any questions, remember we can use the chat feature down below. One of the things I've always kind of wondered, and yes, as somebody that used to work at a World War II museum, I've watched all the Snafu things. Those things are brilliant. Did he, as somebody who really becomes a children's author in his mid-50s, is this what he wanted to do? Is this what he evolved in? Did he like it? I mean, or is this something that just, this paid the bills?
So that's what's fascinating about Seuss's stories. It's a little bit of all that. Seuss initially gets into it because there's money on the table. As we pointed out with Mulberry Street, he wasn't prohibited from doing that. Mulberry Street is, you know, a straight ahead, you know, just it's a rhyming book. It doesn't have that pedagogy behind it. His next book is Bartholomew Cup, the 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins, which was one of my favorite books. But it doesn't look like any other Seuss book. It's a fairy tale almost. And so this is Seuss in his early works exploring the form before he kind of arrives at his own style. And that, you know, Seuss is great at rhyme the entire time. He's always got that real inherent sense of rhythm, again, that we see him doing, you know, in his minstrel show that he wrote. But in the 40s, and I never have enough time to add all this in it, but I'll talk about this right now. Something really important happens after Seuss gets out of the military. He's got about 7 kids' books behind him. He's still working in Hollywood, thinking that's what's going to pay the bills as he's done these kids' books, because he does love doing the kids' books. He thinks they're fun, but they're not paying the bills. He's still paying the bills with ad work. But he's asked to come and give a lecture at the University of Utah to a week-long seminar on writing kids' books to aspiring children's authors. And Seuss takes this very seriously. He reads everything he can on the history of children's books. And it actually gives me chills to talk about it because this document is in the archives, the Seuss archives at the University of California, San Diego, and it's in his handwriting on yellow pads. It's him putting down in writing for the first time ever his thoughts on children's books and his thoughts on writing for children and what's important and what children respond to. And that's the moment when Seuss, as he's putting together his notes for this class, he sort of arrives at this understanding that children's books, and this is 10 years before The Cat, or at least 5, before The Cat in the Hat comes along, before he's challenged to take on Dick and Jane. Even before that, he's already acknowledging that kids' books are kind of terrible. That kids' books, the worst thing he could call the book was, he called it a bunny book, which means you're writing an intentionally saccharine, sweet story for children, helping them become good citizens. You're not entertaining them. You're not doing anything for fun. Seuss himself wasn't a big fan of comic books, but he kept pointing to comics as the competition and saying, kids are reading these. They're reading comic books because they're fun and they're energetic and they're colorful and they have a plot. Remember Seuss and Frank Capra, plot is moving the story forward. So in that University of Utah lecture, Seuss is writing down for the first time what makes those books, what makes great books for children, how kids are an audience that deserve great books of their own. This is, again, before Cat in the Hat. So Seuss arrives sort of independently at this understanding, at this belief that kids deserve great books. And that sort of changes his outlook on the way he's producing books. A lot of these books you see that we talked about, If I Ran the Zoo, Scrambled Eggs, Super, Beyond Zebra, they were produced sort of in that motivated phase when he was, very encouraged about giving kids great books to read. They don't necessarily have that pedagogy behind them yet, but he's intentionally now trying to give kids great books. He's intentionally writing for that audience. He's really the first one to have a brand. I mean, you had Ferdinand the Bull had been out about the time. Eloise was a children's book. Curious George was around at that time. So Seuss is moving into this sort of rarefied era of children's writers and authors who are deliberately aiming at that group, but treating them as serious readers, which is a game changer. You didn't see that before. And then, of course, once you arrive at Cat in the Hat, Seuss really has that calling. Like, he really believes, building upon the University of Utah lectures, really comes to that understanding now of why these, you can give kids books, kids deserve great books. And the other thing you can do at the same time is actually teach them how to read. And that to him was one of the most important things he had ever done as well, was he was giving them books they want to read. And for him, that was a gateway drug to literature. You give a kid a book they want to read, they're going to keep reading. And that to him was really important. So again, there's that evolution of Seuss and his motivation in writing that you can see him sort of becoming what we think of as Dr. Seuss, the guy who wants to make reading fun. It happens there in 1954 with The Cat in the Hat, 57.
Was there one that was his particular favorite, one that he just really lit up the room when you talked about?
He was a big fan, actually, of the Grinch. His license plate said Grinch. He was a big fan of the Grinch. He felt the Grinch got a bum rap all the time. One of the things I think is really fun about the Grinch is, so remember, Seuss has made his career up until this time teaching you that Christmas comes from a store. He's in advertising. The message of the Grinch is that Christmas doesn't come from a store. I think this is Seuss intentionally wrestling with this issue. And at the end of that, the Grinch has the great realization that Christmas doesn't come from a store. Christmas means something more. And it ends on that sort of brotherhood of man note where they're all sitting down for dinner together. And Seuss really struggled with that ending. But there's a great story where these two little boys whose last name was actually Grinch wrote Seuss a letter and said, every Christmas we get picked on and beat up because, our last name is Grinch. And Seuss wrote them a letter back and said, tell your friends they're stupid, because the Grinch isn't the bad guy. What's important about this story is where you end up, not where you started. So he always felt that the Grinch had gotten a bum rap. People often ask him, if you were going to invite the cat, who would you invite to dinner, the cat or the Grinch? And Seuss said, absolutely the Grinch. The cat's going to come and make a big mess. But the Grinch, he's going to be the guy at the table you want to talk to.
Obviously, Seuss was in the news recently about the banning. I'm sure you've been asked this every time you talk, but what was your thoughts about what was going on in the news, and how would Theodor Geisel react to Dr. Seuss being banned?
Well, let's look at this first. So here are the 6 books that Banned is not really the right word. Now, I hate to have to parse this, but this was curation by Dr. Seuss Enterprises. This was not, these books weren't boycotted, anything like that. These are books that often sort of rose to the top of the discussion about Seuss and the complicated issue of race. And Dr. Seuss Enterprises, which is the organization that's responsible for his legacy, eventually decided this doesn't reflect his brand. This doesn't reflect his message. So these are the 6 books that have been removed from circulation. Green Eggs and Ham is not on here. Cat in the Hat is not on here. These are the books that are on the list. And I probably you couldn't have named any of these. The only one I really would have been able to name before I did my deep dive into Seuss is Mulberry Street. The rest of these I didn't really know. So there's 6 books you kind of haven't heard of. All the ones that you still love. There's still more than 50 Seuss books out there that haven't been pulled from print. So these are the 6 that Dr. Seuss Enterprises pulled. Now let's look at why some of the stuff that was problematic. So this is a panel that was problematic even in Seuss's lifetime. This is from Mulberry Street, and you can see over here in the left-hand corner. This is all the people who joined the parade, and you can see right over here it says a Chinese man who eats with sticks. In the original art, this Chinese man is actually yellow and has a pigtail. Seuss went back later and removed that. So the reason he's not yellow and has no pigtail is in his own lifetime, Seuss even recognized that was a problem and removed that part of the drawing. Now it's not much better. And what Seuss then later said is now he looks like an Irishman, which isn't really all that helpful. But so this is one of the problematic panels. And again, in Seuss's lifetime, he knew that this was a problematic depiction of Asian Americans. Seuss can be what I call sort of iconically, pictographically lazy at times, especially when it comes to exotic culture. Now, one of the other people in this panel here on Mulberry Street, as you see on the back of the elephant, is the Rajah. I mean, this is sort of central casting version of a Rajah. It's not really the way they look. And people will point out, this is a caricature. But Seuss, when he tends to portray exotic cultures, his natural flex is to kind of revert to this kind of a stereotype. He does it as well, even up here in the upper left-hand corner. If you would ask Seuss to draw the wealthy, somebody rich, they were going to look like this. They were going to have their top hats and their monocles and their striped trousers. Again, he's being sort of pictographically lazy. But it becomes very problematic in books. So I think probably the worst offender is this one right here. This is from If I Ran the Zoo. And this is him depicting, Pygmy tribes in Africa. And it is straight out of, the horrific stereotypes that we dealt into. So this is at a time, and this is done in the 50s when you see Asian Americans, Charlie Chan's played by a white actor in pancake makeup with slant eyes. Seuss is operating in that air. It's not excusable, but that's the air he's operating in, and he tends to revert to these sort of easy stereotypes when he does it. This down here in the corner again. This is sort of his version of Eastern culture. Seuss reverts to that quite a bit. The other problematic, these are panels out of I think this one at the top is Scrambled Egg Super. Anytime Seuss is dealing with the Inuit culture or Eskimo, this is the way they look. This one on the bottom is Mcgillicutt's pool. And you've got the fish that are coming from the Arctic Circle who look like they have the Eskimo hoods on. So again, it's easy stereotypes for Seuss. He drops into that when he's working in this. I think, given how even in his own lifetime, he had sort of struggled with that issue in Mulberry Street, understanding that it was problematic, I don't think he would have a problem just pulling these out of circulation. It doesn't represent what he wants to do. I mean, Seuss wouldn't have known the word representation, but again, I think he would acknowledge that these are problematic. He did run into, in his lifetime, he ran into questions about misogyny. People often accuse him of being a misogynist, and Seuss would respond to that, well, if you can tell me the sex of any of my creatures, I'll leave you in my will, because he thought most of his creatures were sexless, and that wasn't an issue. So it's Seuss is complicated with race because you've got you're engaging in racist imagery. I don't think Seuss himself was racist. Again, I think he could be very lazy about the way he depicted exotic culture. This is a man that, remember, when he was in the army, was doing anti-Japanese propaganda and came around to realize that, we had horribly wronged, we'd horribly wronged the Japanese, that they should be brought back onto the world stage. The book Horton Hears a Who is actually his love letter to the Japanese people. He had visited Japan, and that book is dedicated to his tour guide and translator when he was in Japan. So the message of Horton Hears a Who, a person's a person, no matter how small, he's actually saying that to the Japanese people. We hear you, welcome to the world. We value you as people. So Seuss is constantly evolving on these issues of race and marginalization, and a book like The Sneetches, I don't think you could write a book like The Sneetches unless you had evolved to that point where the message of The Sneetches, that's the book where you have the Sneetches, some have stars on their bellies, some don't, and those with stars start trying to elevate themselves above those who don't, and then everything gets mixed around and they realize that it just doesn't matter, and that's the message of The Sneetches ultimately. So you can see Seuss evolving throughout his career. Some of his really problematic work is actually some of his very early advertising work, with primarily the way he depicts African Americans. And again, he's taking it straight out of the stereotypes, Little Black Sambo and some of that horrific stuff they used to see back in the 20s. Seuss, again, is swimming in that pool at the time, just being that sort of, again, pictographically lazy. But that's where you see some of the real problems. And if you trace the arc of his career, you'll start to see all of those stereotypes go away. And by the time in the 70s, at one point, he's asked about some of these problematic depictions of Japanese people in some of his World War II art. And he said, at the time, I thought it was funny. And now I'm not sure about that. So Seuss in his own lifetime was even struggling with this. So I think our conversation that we're having about this reflects Seuss's own struggle with this, late in his own life.
As you were going through his works, is there a book of his that is a favorite of yours? And
so great question. I'll tell you, and it's hard for me because before I got into Seuss, I could have named his greatest hits. I could have named maybe 4 or 5 books. And one of the great jobs of being a biographer of Dr. Seuss is you get to go back and read all of his books and call it work and call it research, which I did. And the book I actually fell in love with is one of his problematics. I love If I Ran the Zoo. I think If I Ran the Zoo was some of his best verse anywhere. It's also the first time you'll see the word nerd appear anywhere in print. Although in his book, it looks like a bird, kind of an angry bird in a sweater. But within 2 years, it had already taken on the meaning that we now apply to the word nerd. So Seuss actually originated the word nerd, and it happens in that book. I love the writing in that book. It's bouncy, it's fun. I think it's some of his best verse ever. But it's one of the problematic books. Mcgillicutt's Pool is another book that, and this is where I sometimes struggle with taking these books out of circulation, because there's some cool stuff going on in some of these. Mcgillicutt's Pool, for example, is his only book in full color. Every page of Mcgillicutt's Pool is this beautiful sort of acrylic wash. It's a really gorgeous book. So, there's still things in these books that are worthwhile, even as, again, Seuss is reverting to some of those careless stereotypes. So If I Ran the Zoo is one that surprised me. I had never heard of it and read it and surprised. And again, it's where the word nerd is. But I'm always a fan, of some of the classics. How can you not love Green Eggs and Ham? I think that's one that still rises to the top of everybody's list. Seuss himself actually thought the Lorax was probably his best book. That was the book he always said he was kind of the proudest of. I think the fact that even in his lifetime that it was banned so often is made him proud of that book, and he knew he had made his point.
Well, considering your subject matter, the people you've covered, who's next on your radar? What's your next project?
I don't know. I don't have a project. This is the longest I've ever been since 2006 without knowing what my next project was. I had arrived on Seuss before the George Lucas book even came out, and so this is the longest I've ever gone without knowing. 15, 16 years now, I've always known what my next project is. I don't know what it is right now. I'm dying to do a musician. I did make a run at Ringo, who's never been done, believe it or not, and he told me no with peace and love. You know, I'd love to do, I would love to do a musician. I would love to do a comedian. I haven't done a woman yet. I'd love to find, you know, some subject to do there as well. So I'm always on the lookout. If you think of anything, hit me up on Twitter and let me know.
Well, thank you so much for doing this tonight. This has been great. I greatly appreciate you taking the time, and continued success with this. I think this has been fascinating, and thanks for joining us tonight. This is I really appreciate this.
Well, it's my pleasure. And Mark, people don't know, you and I have been trying to do this a long, long time.
That's true.
And then the world caught fire and changed our good intentions. So I'm glad we finally made this happen. So thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for hanging in there with me. I know watching these things on Zoom is not always fun, so I appreciate it.
All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thank you, Brian, and good night, and thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.